Meine Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, cari colleghi, I'd now like to present to you Professor Giovanni Ceccarelli, who has traveled the long way from Parma in Italy to Essen to give this evening our lecture in the Ringvorlesung. Professor Ceccarelli got his PhD in economic and social history in 2001 at the Universita Bocconi in Milan. His, I guess, revised thesis was published in 2003 under the title Il gioco e il peccato, economia e rischio nel tardo medioevo, meaning the game and the sin, or game and sin, economics and risk in the late Middle Ages. And it was published with the renowned publishers Il Mulino in Bologna. From 2002 to 2005, he held fellowships, first by the Centro Studi sul Credito e sui Lombardi nel Medioevo at Asti, and then by the History Department at the University of Padua. Since then, since 2005, he has held positions at the Department of Economy at the University of Parma, first as a researcher, ricercatore, and, if I'm right, since this year as Associate Professor of History of Economics. Giovanni Ceccarelli is one of the leading experts, if not the leading expert, on the history of risk in the Middle Ages and under very different aspects, from the economic aspects, but also theological aspects. So he knows a lot about the field and his under different perspectives, and this is why we wanted to have him here. He has published extensively on the subject in Italian, but also in French and English. I have already mentioned his book, Il gioco e il peccato. Other notable publications of his are Risky Business, Theological and Canonical Thought on Insurance from the 13th to the 17th century, published in the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies in 2001, or Gambling and Economic Thought in the Late Middle Ages, 2006. Another article of his is The Price for Risk-Taking, Marine Insurance and Probability Calculus in the Late Middle Ages, 2007 in the Electronic Journal for History of Probabilities and Statistics. Recently, he has published another book, which we have in our library, Un mercato del rischio, assicurare e farsi assicurare nella Firenze rinascimentale, which is a market of risk, insuring and being or getting insured in Renaissance Florence. Tonight, he will lecture about a subject which is obviously related to this subject. He will lecture about Renaissance risk-takers. Professor Ceccarelli, we are looking forward to your lecture. Il palco è suo.
Thank you very much. Good evening. So first of all, let me thank Professor Brakensiek and Professor Scheller and the whole Historische Institute for this invitation. I prepared this lecture with real pleasure, thinking that I was going to share my decade-long knowledge on the field with an investigation group that puts the emphasis on a really stimulating and intriguing topic to explore, such as that of managing contingency. Speaking of sharing and pleasure, I would have loved to share with you your beautiful language, but I must confess that I am unable to do so, so please accept my apologies for giving this lecture in English and not in German. The final centuries of the Middle Ages are commonly considered one of the turning points in the way risks are approached. It is usually stressed that during the Renaissance, traditional attitudes are progressively abandoned in favor of a more modern perception. The future stops to be seen as a territory that cannot be explored, subject to the unknowable will of God, and starts to be seen as a land of possibility in which decisions made by individuals count. Lucien Febvre brilliantly summarized this change using the expression transfert de ciel à terre, transfer from heaven to earth, and suggested that the driving force of such change was the emerging concept of risk. As the Nobel laureate passed away just last week, Douglas North, pointed out, risk is the medium by which the unknown can be objectified, allowing actors to finally frame a realm that appeared to go beyond their comprehension and control. In this lecture, I will use marine insurance as a shortcut. Let me see. To have a broad idea on changing perceptions of risk in early modern Europe. Started to be used around mid-14th century, this contract constitutes a relevant change in comparison with all the previously used arrangements to transfer business risk to another party. Insurance is the first known contract in which the perils of sea trade are the specific object of the settlement. Moreover, insurance fosters quantifications, since such perils have to be estimated in numerical terms, the insurance premium being calculated as a percentage of the covered value. There is another reason why looking at insurance can offer a good point of observation for broader phenomena, and this has essentially to do with Florence, a city that during the Renaissance appears to be an environment in which changes attitudes on risk could be more easily developed. So in this lecture, I will begin providing some information about the Florentine insurance market in the Renaissance. Then I will summarize theories about the possibility of exploiting risk in economic terms with reference to theological and arithmetical thought. I will then show that in Florence, insurance and risk were relevant in practice as well as in theory, and that the two realms tended to interact. And then finally, I will take into analysis the insurance market of Renaissance Florence, considering it as a testing ground to look at the way sea risks were assessed. Florentine risk-takers, as it will be shown, combine two different approaches, one based on proto-probability, the other on what cognitive science defines expert intuition. So let's begin with giving some information about the market. During the Renaissance, Florence is one of the major insurance markets, if not the main one. I was able to reconstruct in the book that Professor Scheller showed you its basic features through two sets of sources, the Datini and the Salviati archives, that provide information on about 1,500 insurance contracts from the late 14th century to the first decades of the 16th century. Already by the end of the 14th century, Florence occupies a prominent role, being one of the few places, together with Genoa, Pisa, Venice, and Barcelona, specialized in this type of business. Due to the lack of significant competition, Florence intercepted a demand that was independent from the advantages deriving from its geographic location. Later on, for instance, in the early 16th century, though competition between insurance markets became much more fierce, this role does not seem to have declined. It can be reasonably estimated that more than 700 contracts were signed in Florence every year, covering shipments traveling from Ireland to the Middle East or from the Azore Islands to Zeeland. Florence shows a great ability in attracting a foreign demand that is unrelated to any geographic competitive advantage, a demand that corresponded in that period to around 60% of the total amounts insured in the market. A typical example, just to give you an idea of how Florence was able to attract people who wanted to be insured is the trend offered by the number of businessmen who, being in need to insure their cargoes traveling between Bordeaux and London, prefer to sign a policy in Florence instead of doing that in France or in England. So Florence insurance market, the attractiveness of Florence insurance market confirms somehow its efficiency and its place in the European scenario. Now let's start to move to the theoretical part of the story. Given the relevant role played by the city in the insurance business, it's not surprising to find that the vast majority of the contribution concerning the moral lawfulness of this contract are related to Florence or nearby centers of nowadays Tuscany. The debate was in part developed in the square and churches of the city and those of nearby Pisa, and in part in the Dominican and Franciscan studia of these centers, as well as in the faculties of theology and law of the Florentine University. If one considers the list of thinkers who wrote on insurance during the 14th and the 15th century, their geographic homogeneity is striking. Until the first decades of the 16th century, the only exceptions are the writing of the Genoese jurist Bartolomeo Bosco and those of a Polish theologian, Matthew of Krakow, that, however, have had both, quite significantly, very little influence on the overall treatment of this subject. I have to change the slide because, yeah, this is more. And here we can have a list of these. A list of the places where people were coming. Discussing about marine insurance seems at that time a matter only for Florentines or at least for Tuscans. This includes theologians like Bartolomeo San Concordio, Piero Strozzi, Francesco da Empoli, or Domenico Pantaleoni, lawyers like Paolo di Castro and Lorenzo Ridolfi, and preachers like Bernardino of Siena, Antonino Pierozzi of Florence, or Giovanni de Milanesi of Prato. Even the scenario in which the first commercial law treatise on this subject is located, written at the end of the 15th century by a Portuguese lawyer called Pedro de Santarém, is that of Florence, Pisa and Leghorn, cities where the author lived for several years acting as a diplomat of the King of Portugal. Okay. Focusing on the content of these writings, the crucial role played by the concept of risk becomes clear. It is thanks to this concept that already by mid-13th century, the possibility that events may or may not occur in the future has an economic and tradable for money value appeared in theological writings. In just a few decades, this opinion becomes mainstream among theologians and jurists, essentially through two main lines of reasoning. On the one side, a formal analysis of contracts allowed to state that property could be transferred on condition without undermining God's prerogatives. Gambling served as a model to progressively frame several types of agreements and risk management tools into a specific class, later called as aleatory contract category, that was considered completely lawful, or at least from a formal point of view. Moral concerns regarding the motivations, greed, superstition, and so on, that lead to engage in such activities did remain, but the reason why these contracts were undertaken was fully separated from their formal nature. On the other side, theologians acknowledged that taking risk was a distinctive element of business, and that profits deriving from such activities could be ascribed to the actor's ability in evaluating such risk. Of great influence was the comparison made between friars and businessmen. The former ones had to precisely forecast their material need for the future to avoid the risk of breaking the vow of living in poverty, like the Franciscans or the Dominicans, while the latter ones were trained in taking risk, making predictions on the prospects and dangers of commercial ventures. This special condition of being skilled risk managers and forecasters entitled businessmen to reap profits from activities that, if conducted by ordinary people, usually fell under the ban of usury. Quickly applied to insurance, these ideas allowed to develop two arguments in favor of the contract when it made its appearance during the first decades of the 14th century. The two lines of reasoning allowed to bypass an equation inherited from canon law between usurers and investors who indirectly finance commercial ventures. The Dominicans argue that risk assumption has a different legal meaning depending on the contract adopted. Bartolomeo San Concordio, Piero Strozzi, and Domenico Pantaleoni consider insurance in terms of a lease contract that lawfully includes a charge for the risk suffered, the premium, by the underwriter until the insured merchandise safely arrives to destination. This opinion, developed more systematically by Lorenzo Ridolfi, will dominate until the beginnings of the 16th century. A more complex approach is followed by the Franciscans, which essentially rested on the idea that risks, when ran by businessmen, were different from those suffered by others. Applied to insurance by Francesco of Empoli, this line of reasoning will be fully developed by Bernardino of Siena. According to this latter, the insurer has a right to profit since he takes risks on behalf of the community in which he lives, giving support to the primary source of welfare of the city, namely marine trade. Another feature that made Florence a place where the reasoning on risk and marine insurance could flourish more than elsewhere was the exceptional degree of mathematical literacy that School of Abacus granted to its population. In comparison with other places, the city was crowded with teachers of commercial arithmetic, and several of these teachers devoted their attention to problems related to risk, chance, and probability calculation. Mainstream reconstructions do acknowledge that Renaissance mathematics made significant improvements toward a modern vision of risk, but also point out that the empirical approach that stemmed from commercial arithmetic did not allow to formally outline a theory of probability. So, notwithstanding the writings of Luca Pacioli and Gerolamo Cardano, the birth of probability calculus has to be considered Pascal's solution to the so-called problem of division of the stakes, concerning a repeated game of chance interrupted before its natural conclusion. A simplified version of this problem runs as follows. Two persons playing heads or tail with a coin agree that the first one to win a given number of rounds will get the whole stake. If the game is interrupted before it ends, how should be the stake divided? The key to solve this problem lays in separating what happened before the interruption of the game from what might have happened after. It is through this separation that an epistemological approach is finally applied and the realm of mathematical probability envisaged. Renaissance mathematicians who first posed this problem failed in solving it exactly because they were not able to make this distinction. The discovery of unedited manuscripts in which commercial arithmetic teachers discuss similar issues since the late 13th century has recently questioned such reconstruction. In these sources, abacus teachers go beyond the practical approach typical of business calculation and hint at issues more related to theory, not only because they pose the questions needed to develop probability calculus, but also because in some cases they hinted as well as at the right rationale by separating past, what happened, from future, what might have happened, events. It is furthermore interesting to notice that these earlier versions of the problem of division of the stake were not concerned with gambling, but with the partition of share of business partnership that broke up before their originally envisaged deadline. It also appears that the Tuscan regions, once again, and Florence in particular, were a fertile ground for such kind of discussions, stressing once more what appears to be a vocation of the city. Between the 14th and the 15th century, several Florentine abbatisti debated the problem later discussed by Luca Pacioli, providing solutions that were, however, wrong. Yet in some cases, the key point of what might have happened if the game or the partnership continued is hinted at. And it is the case of the problems discussed by an anonymous teacher, perhaps Maestro Antonio De Mazzinghi, in a collection titled Regole dell'Arzibra, or by Filippo Maria Calandri in his treatise called Varie ragioni tratte da vari luoghi. These problems do not outline a modern theory of the probable, such as the one developed after the 17th century when numerical probability and statistics were combined together by Pascal, Huygens, John Grant, and John de Witt. They reveal, however, a breakthrough with traditional approaches in framing risk related to commercial ventures, introducing a proto-probabilistic way of reasoning that could help to estimate the perils of sea trade in spite of the lack of accurate statistical records. Several elements, we had a beautiful picture of an abacus school. I have to show it to you because this comes from an illumination from one of these, from the treatise that I mentioned before of Filippo Maria Calandri, a copy in Florence Library. Several elements suggest that in Renaissance, Florence ideas about how to face and evaluate risk did not remain confined in commercial arithmetic books or in treatises on usury, but rather tended to circulate in realms that usually are considered as self-secluded. Biographies of merchants, friars, and mathematicians reveal a more intertwined situations. Insurers received their education from abacus teachers used to deal with probability calculus, as we have just seen. Theologians discussing the lawfulness of insurance came from families involved in such business. Relatives of mathematicians had an active role in the insurance market. The degree of interaction between theory and practice appears to be higher than elsewhere, though so far we know very little about a very complex topic that still requires to be investigated in depth. A first field of interactions concerns family ties and environment. Several lawyers and friars who debate about marine insurance have kinship relations with merchants who have an active role in that industry. The oldest insurance policy preserved in the Datini archive is a contract dating 1379, underwritten in Pisa in favor of Baldo di Niccolò Ridolfi, uncle of the above-mentioned jurist Lorenzo Ridolfi, who 20 years later provided an extensive analysis of this type of contract. A similar case involves Giovanni de Milanesi of Prato, who around mid-15th century provided an insightful description of the insurance trade in his short treatise on contracts, Summula de Contractibus. This Franciscan theologian and preacher came from an extremely active, from a family of extremely active merchants that did not disdain to make investment in the insurance business, as some policies underwritten in the 1520s by his descendants testify. Another interesting case is that of Cristofano Pantaleoni, one of the main insurance brokers of the Florentine market during the last decades of the 14th century. This professional middleman is a close relative of Domenico Pantaleoni, the Dominican friar who 3 decades earlier was one of the first to include marine insurance into a broader discussion about the lawfulness of financial techniques. Perhaps the most striking example is the one provided by Piero di Ubertino Strozzi. Let's take a look at his family tree just to have an idea. By carefully observing his family tree, one gets the clear impression that this theologian was literally surrounded, he's the one highlighted in light blue, by brothers, uncle, cousins, and nephews, all devoted to long-distance trade. These, the one highlighted in red, are those who, for sure, we know were engaged in that type of business. Given these premises, it is not surprising to find several of these relatives also acting as underwriters in the Florentine and Pisan insurance market of the late 14th century, like, for instance, Michele and Lorenzo Di Carlo, who were both sons of one of Pietro Strozzi's cousins. It was not, however, just a matter of simple contiguity between merchants and theorists. While the average Florentine businessmen were well educated in commercial mathematics, some of them reveal a solid background in the juridical and theological fields and have no hesitation in taking position on issues that one would think only reserved to friars and lawyers. Franco Sacchetti, a typical prototype of what Christian Beck named marchand d'écrivain, openly argues in his Sermoni Evangelici, written in 1380, that insurance policies should be considered unlawful, revealing a good knowledge of the ongoing debate on this contract. Even more interesting is the example given in the early 15th century by Cino di Francesco Rinuccini, who was a prominent Florentine humanist as well as the main underwriter of the local insurance market and that of nearby Pisa of that time. In one of his political writings dating 1406, Rinuccini provides a thorough reconstruction of the theories of Francesco of Empoli and Piero Strozzi, proving that he was perfectly aware of the ongoing theological debate concerning the financial tools used in the market. Interactions as such, however, were not. So interactions as such are not confined only to theology and business activity, but also commercial mathematics was concerned. The above-mentioned Filippo Maria Calandri, who ran together with his brother Pier Maria one of the most renowned schools of abacus of the city, could count among his pupils several ones that later had a brilliant career in commerce and banking. Two of them in particular, Bernardo and Antonio Gondi, are to be recalled since in the early decades of the 16th century they will be among the most active players on the local insurance markets. Partners of one of the main Florentine companies based in Lyons, they frequently appear as beneficiaries as well as underwriters of the policies subscribed in Florence. Interactions work also the other way around, with members of families that had a well-established tradition as abacus teachers, like the Corbizzi or the da Romena, who engaged themselves in the insurance business. So there is nothing unusual in finding Guigliadore di Tedice de Mazzinghi, likely a relative of the above-mentioned mathematician Maestro Antonio de Mazzinghi, among the underwriters of the Datini firm in the late 14th century. Turning once more to the Calandri family, this interaction becomes striking when one discovers that Calandro, the son of Pier Maria, became in the late 1520s one of the cashiers of the Salviati company, being that company, in that period, by far the most relevant commercial firm of the city. Yet Calandro di Pier Maria's skills in mathematics were not just confined in bookkeeping, since he probably took advantage of the innovative ideas on probability of his uncle Filippo Maria by acting as underwriter in several insurance policies. So, having traced the cultural framework in which insurance transactions took place, it is now possible to turn to the market in order to look for a testing ground where interactions among law, religion, arithmetic, and risk management techniques can be further investigated. Before doing that, it is necessary to briefly explain which were the variables that a businessman had to deal with when he was signing an insurance contract. It is possible to provide a sketchy list of these variables referring to the studies carried on by scholars who have for a long time investigated on marine insurance and sea transport in the early modern period. It is important, however, to emphasize that these factors are explicitly or implicitly included in the set of risks that through the contract were usually transferred from the insured party to the underwriters. Already by the last decades of the 14th century, policies started to contain standard formulas to cover a broad variety of events that might threaten the cargo's safe arrival to destination. A first class of variables can be considered to be structural, since they refer to elements that are stable and thus predictable over a relatively long period of time. These include, for instance, the type of vessel used and the reputation of the shipmasters that steers it, the length of the itinerary to cover, not only in terms of physical distance, but also with reference to specific stretches of sea to cross and stopovers to make, the season in which the travel occurs, since it affected the expectation of weather conditions, the type of merchandise that was insured, and its degree of fragility and perishability. A second set of variables can be classed as contingents, since they are related to factors that may change in a very short time, from day to day or even within hours. These typically encompass piracy and privateering, wars, especially when conducted on the sea, seizing, namely the capture of a merchant vessel for reasons connected to policy and wars. These risks were all quite clear in the mind of Renaissance businessmen. We find them openly stated in a renowned trade handbook written around mid-15th century by Benedetto Cotrugli, the Arte di Mercatura, that we can see translated right here. We can read them together. Cotrugli says, before underwriting a contract, businessmen have to constantly ask for and inquire on pirates and evil people, wars, truces, reprisals, and all the things that may perturb the sea. Have a good knowledge of the seaports and the beaches, of the distance from one place to another, and they must take into account the condition of the shipmasters of the vessel, and they must consider the merchandise. Now, we can move to, having said briefly what were the risks that they had to cope with, we can move to take a closer analysis of such elements. Insurance policies can suggest many things regarding how people involved in this business evaluated the variables of risk. For instance, it is possible to gather together a group of contracts which differ simply for one of the above listed factors, the type of vessel, the season, the length of the itinerary, etc., to see how this variation affected the insurance premium. Moreover, there are many policies in which an additional clause introduces a change in one single variable, while all the other elements of risk remain the same. For instance, some underwriters may agree to run the risk only on a given commodity, or may decide not to cover it for a specific part of the itinerary. These settlements have an immediate impact on the insurance premium, providing indirect information on the manner in which forecasting and decision-making was conducted. But most important, these clauses show that businessmen clearly were able to isolate the single variables of risk, and at least to try to estimate them in economic terms. Florence is once again an ideal set to carry out a thorough quantitative analysis. As I already mentioned, the Datini and the Salviati archives allow to consider data concerning more than 1,500 contracts. To have an idea of how risk-takers' reasoning functioned, it can be useful to take a close look at a policy that is dated 1525. In the contract, the contracting parties agree in granting to the shipmasters sailing from the port of Ancona to that of Constantinople the possibility to make a stopover in the Aegean island of Chios, In such case, however, the parties established that the premium would increase from 6% to 7%. The reason for this 1% increase lays in the fact that businessmen knew that accidents, shipwrecks, as well as merchandise damages were more likely to occur during docking operations. Another example comes from a policy subscribed in 1397, in which an option concerning the medium of transportation, a galley or a brigantine, is envisaged, determining an increase of the premium from 1 to 1.5%. The underlying rationale for this discrimination was that the former vessel was better provided with weapons than the latter. Moving from single cases to a general overview, data confirmed that structural variables had a direct impact on the economic estimation of risk. Transporting a fragile kind of goods, sailing in a season of bad weather, having to face a longer itinerary, or to cross a stretch of sea considered to be unsafe, using a vessel not provided with armaments, all this always turned out to make insurance premium grow. The last two variables listed above, factor vessel and factor itinerary, appear in particular to be the most relevant ones, suggesting the existence of a hierarchical ranking among sea risks. Moreover, data concerning factor vessel and factor itinerary are those in which a well-tested pattern of forecasting seems to be followed with premium variations that indicate a certain degree of accuracy in making a provision on the likelihood that an event may or may not occur. Fluctuations in premiums reveal that businessmen probably approached risk holding on a proto-probabilistic way of reasoning. To make this type of forecasting, accurate statistical records were not required and could be replaced with a rough observation of the frequency of past accidents occurred in the sea trade. Obviously, not everybody could be able to make such type of provision, but those who were active on the Florentine insurance business had probably the suitable mentality. Two striking features of this market were its limited dimension and the social homogeneity of those who were involved in it. A reasonable estimation for the early 16th century suggests that only about 600 or 700 people took part in the transaction, a number that corresponds to a very limited fraction of the inhabitants of the city, which at that time had a population of around 50,000 persons. Beside very limited exceptions, insured parties and underwriters tended to share a common social and cultural background, roughly coinciding with individuals who made their living out of long-distance trade, textile industry, and banking activities. Well-trained in business and accounting, with a high level of education in commercial arithmetic, who, better than those belonging to this group, could handle the threats of sea trade and make reasonable estimations about it? Sea risks that businessmen had to deal with were, however, often less stable over time. Wars and piracy were common threats during the Renaissance, and scholars have stressed that a great share of sea accidents were caused by variables that are to be labeled under contingency. Additional clauses to contracts reveal that contingent risks were singularly evaluated and quantified, following thus a pattern similar to the one that was applied to structural risks. The average premium increase suggests, however, that when dealing with contingency, a different and perhaps less refined approach to estimation is at work, with rates that typically are 1.5 or twice as much as those charged in normal situations. Quantitative data coming from the Salviati archive confirm this picture. When the war between the Kingdom of France and the Augsburg Empire broke out in 1521, it took only a few months in Florence for insurance premiums to grow by 180%, to later soar to levels that were 3 times higher than those of the pre-war period. Proto-probabilistic reasoning can only partially be used to cope with contingency, since turmoil caused by privateering and military conflicts determine a framework in which insurance markets become extremely volatile. Bubbles and shocks were ready to explode at any moment when rumors on a given pirate or on a naval clash spread, producing a sharp increase on the rates even if in a few hours. A 1525 Florentine contract on the Southampton-Leghorn itinerary shows the following sequence of the premium in the same day: 14.5%, 15%, and 16%. And this is not at all an exceptional case. A few months later, the premium charged for merchandise traveling on the same ship from Leghorn to Marseille grows in just 3 days from 5.5% to 6%, and then from 6% to 7%. A good example of how difficult it was to correctly quantify probability of success or failure is provided by Giovanbattista di Marco Bracci, former general manager of the Medici Bank, and who was among the main underwriters of the Florentine market in the 1520s. So it's a very representative case of an experienced insurer. Bracci seems to confirm his good training in business by profiting of the hike in insurance rates caused by the above-mentioned war between France and the Augsburg, with net gains that until 1524 are above 7% the capital invested. In the following years, however, the picture totally changes, with heavy losses due to the repayment of several insurance claims caused by 4 seizures and 3 shipwrecks that will bring to an abrupt end of a decade-long insurance activity in 1526. The premiums that Bracci agreed to underwrite were clearly too low to match the threats posed by a persisting state of warfare, revealing that contingency could easily lead to a misjudgment. When factors to handle become overwhelming and thus, using Frank Knight terminology, risk turns into uncertainty, the standard way of considering prospects and dangers ends up being misleading. Statistics, even if at hand, and of course this was not the case for Renaissance people, are useless to forecast the exact stretch of sea in which a privateer will strike or a naval fleet will operate. Though an efficient system of commercial correspondence granted information about these threats, it was nevertheless too slow to provide news updated to the point to make reasonable provisions. Yet, proto-probability, later evolved in mathematical probability, is only one among the many of existing types of reasoning that were used to face unknown events. Cognitive sciences and behavioral economics have shown that one does not need to return to pre-modern society to discover a multifaceted array of attitudes related to forecasting. The logical probability of intuitive expertise, for instance, which is grounded on non-deductive reasoning and on the authority of the actor making the provision, represents an alternative system to the mathematical probability. Science historians have stressed that in the past, and partially still today, different approaches to probability were often used jointly in making predictions. This is likely to be what exactly happened when Renaissance businessmen had to evaluate contingent risk. Taking a closer look at the Florentine market, differences and hierarchies appear. A small group of people has a guiding position not only because of the scale and continuity of its involvement, but also because of the reputation enjoyed among the rest of the investors. To appreciate their role, a brief explanation of how contracts were placed in the market is needed. Merchants willing to be insured, after having established the main features of the agreement with a broker, had to find underwriters interested in the business. One after the other, the insurers subscribed the contract, each being liable only for a limited amount of the total, which usually was quite considerable. Pooling together 30 or more underwriters was common, so it could open the way to never-ending negotiations. The shortcut usually adopted was to go first to a reputed businessman and make him subscribe the contract. Having seen the signature of a respectable person, others will quickly follow, this leading insurer and underwrite the contract at the same premium. This brilliant marketing strategy also reveals how relevant was on pre-modern markets what has been called the power of authority, when exerted by experts that the rest of the traders considered able to make reliable predictions, triggering a pattern that behavioral economics has defined as herding. In Florence, this system was fully at work. Data concerning the 1520s revealed that the number of those who had the role of leading insurer was very small. While about 2/3 of the underwriters never acted in this position, in more than 70% of the contract, those who occupied such role came from the restricted class of the top 10% leading insurer. And in more than 30% of them, it came from the top 1% that was made of a handful of people, namely just 5 persons in total. They all came from the ranks of the most relevant merchant families, and many of them also enjoy a high status in Florentine political life. In other words, they were the most suited to forecast future events, combining proto-probabilistic reasoning with logical probability that rested on their business experience and authoritative judgment. The crucial role played by leading insurance is fully described by businessmen operating in the 18th century markets, but it is noteworthy to recall that similar observations were made around mid-15th century by the above-mentioned Franciscan friar Giovanni dei Milanesi of Prato. So, in concluding, Florence's case shows that multifaceted attitudes in coping with sea risk were at work in the Renaissance insurance business. The overall framework is indeed complex, revealing that new and old attitudes regarding the future events coexisted. Though businessmen and money play a relevant role in the story, marine insurance was not a matter confined to merchant capitalism, and influences from arithmetic law and religion are visible as well. Theology sets the cultural framework in which making profits from sea dangers could be possible, and mathematics contributes in training businessmen to frame unknown risks. Proto-probabilistic attitudes that emerge provide an apparently modern picture of the ideas about future events developed during the Renaissance. However, the logical probability of intuitive expertise was also applied, revealing that traditional approaches had a lasting effect on how commercial ventures were approached. Being entitled to make prediction was not just a matter of individual skills that freely compete in the market, but more often a matter of status and political reputation. The prominent role of leading insurers had to deal with their business experience, but also with hierarchies inherited from an ecclesiastical conception of the society. If reconsidered in a risk-friendly environment such as it was Renaissance Florence, Febvre's transfer de ciel à terre appears to be the result of a fruitful interaction between theory and practice, the outcome of an interplay among risk-takers, friars, and abacus teachers. Thank you.